Over the next few minutes, I'll walk you through step by step how you can take one of these relatively inexpensive picture frames from one of the big box craft stores and transform it into this beautiful walnut and epoxy picture frame that is sure to make a statement. We have a lot of work to do, so let's get started.
To start this project, I need to get the epoxy poured so it can start curing, which means I need to make a mold. I always make my molds using melamine, cheap, fast-drying Alex caulk, a few nails, and silicone mold release spray. I have a few other videos that outline this process in more detail, and I will link them down below, along with all the supplies that I used during this video to make them easy for you to find.
And there it is, there's my mold. There's 3 things that I care about when I make a mold. 1, that it doesn't leak. 2, that my piece doesn't stick to it. And 3, that it didn't cost me a bunch of money. I've never had a client come ask me, how pretty was the mold when you made it? So I wouldn't worry about the mold and the way it looks too much. Just make a mold.
With everything clamped into a level mold and the epoxy thoroughly mixed, we can finally pour. I pretty much exclusively use super clear liquid glass deep pour for any pour over 1/4 of an inch. Recently, I've been getting a lot of questions about the quick curing deep pour epoxy that they make, but I feel like it defeats the purpose. The slow curing epoxy helps with 2 common problems. The first problem is bubbles. The slow curing epoxy allows all the bubbles to escape before the epoxy fully hardens. Second, flash curing. The slow cure produces less heat, so it's less susceptible to flash curing for deeper pours. And with the epoxy poured, I just wait. Most mistakes in epoxy projects come from rushing. Rushing the mold building, rushing mixing process, rushing the hardening time, rushing the sanding process. The list goes on and on. More than any other woodworking project, patience is a virtue with epoxy. Another question I see all the time is, how long should I wait for my epoxy to cure? The bottle says it cures in 72 hours. Here's my answer to this. Sure, your epoxy will cure 85 to 90% after about 72 hours, but most deep pour epoxies need at least another 3 to 6 weeks to cure the final 10 to 15%. Sanding epoxy can be frustrating, but just take your time. Also, using the best sander and sandpaper you can afford will go a long way too. Since I went on a rant there, we need to back up and see how I got here in the first place. I took this out of the mold after about 10 days. Then I sent it through my planer along with some extra strips to get the thickness for all of my frame pieces. Then I ripped these down into 1 3/8 inch strips on my table saw. Anything over an inch should work just fine for this project. Now before I cut everything to length, I need to cut a dado groove thing in the back of each strip that will hold the glass in place later. To do this, I set my table saw up with a sacrificial fence, then make a few shallow cuts along one side of each strip, moving the fence over a little at a time until I get a nice 1/4 inch dado down one side that is 7/16 inch deep. I also need to cut a groove in the back of the frame for these clips to slide into, and that'll help hold the back in place. Now, the width of this cut isn't too important, but it does need to be 1/4 of an inch to the outside of the blade. So I measured over 1/4 of an inch and put my mark on my frame, used that mark to set up my table saw, and made my cuts. Just take some extra time here to make sure you're making the cut correctly. For some reason, this is really confusing for me, but I got it right. Now I can cut these to length, but I need a 45-degree angle on each edge. First, I made some practice cuts with some scrap wood and got my miter saw dialed in. Then, I only cut one side of each piece. This allowed me to cut one corner exactly where I wanted it. Then I can mark out which direction I need the angle to go for my next cut and use a stop block on my miter saw so I get each piece cut perfectly to the same length. You can actually have your saw set up for a perfect 45-degree cut, but if each piece is slightly different in size, then your frame will not come together perfectly in the corners. Be sure that the short side of your cut is the part you are measuring so your glass will fit. Gluing a small piece like this can be a challenge. I decided to use a combination of CA glue on the epoxy and wood glue on the wood. This has 2 benefits. First, the CA glue will act like a clamp and hold everything together while the wood glue dries. Second, the CA glue won't show through in the epoxy like wood glue will. I used some tape to act like clamps while this thing dries, and I didn't see the need to put clamps on a piece this small. However, I did decide to reinforce the corners a little bit and spice things up with some splines. I ran each corner through my table saw using this spline cutting jig thingy I rigged up. Then I glued some white oak splines into place because I had some white oak scraps laying around. Then I just cut them down and sanded them smooth. And before doing the final sanding, I took my 1/8 inch roundover bit and went around all the outside edges. and this is the point that I sanded everything, starting at 120, moving up to 150, and finishing with 180. And now we're back to where the video started. Thank goodness. Lately I've been using this Black Forest monocoat wood oil finish on all of my projects. One advantage of this over Rubio is that you don't need to mix two parts together. It's also a little cheaper. Either way, it's applied the same way and very easy to use.
And if you like this video, then watch the next video on the screen right here. I take a box of scrap walnut, mix in a little epoxy, and create a beautiful Jenga set that is sure to impress your friends and family. And remember, you can build it yourself. Thanks for watching.